Ferdinand VII wanted love, respect, and a lasting heir. Instead, his struggle with a rare anatomical abnormality shaped his marriages and left his dynasty on shaky ground. Even before he became king, French physicians during his captivity in 1811 to 1814 took note of his growing health concerns, hinting that something unusual was at play beneath the royal robes. But it wasn't just about medicine or gossip. Ferdinand's private reality bled into every corner of his reign, influencing alliances, betrayals, and the very future of Spain. So, what secret did Ferdinand carry to his grave, and why did it leave a kingdom reeling? Inside the palace, the end of Ferdinand VII was not the kind of royal send-off that gets painted in gold leaf. The death chamber was thick with the sharp, sour smell of vinegar and camphor, the same mix the palace physicians used to keep royal bodies from turning into a public health crisis. The job wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about keeping up appearances, literally. The king's body had to look dignified for the line of nobles and officials who would file past in the coming days. But beneath the ritual and the chemicals, there was an undercurrent of anxiety that everyone in the room could feel. The Queen, Maria Cristina, stood nearby, her face drawn with the private worry that would later show up in her letters. Servants kept their eyes on the floor. The court physician, sweating through his collar, knew he was about to face the palace's most dangerous secret. The room itself was all marble floors and velvet curtains, but the focus was on the bed where Ferdinand's body lay draped in sheets. Churchmen murmured prayers in Latin, but even they seemed distracted. The closer anyone got to the king, the more awkward things became. Everyone knew that royal bodies weren't just flesh and blood, they were symbols of an entire country, and any flaw was a threat to the image of the monarchy. That's why the physician's hands shook a little as he prepared for the next step. He wasn't just preserving a corpse, he was guarding the future of a dynasty. As soon as Ferdinand's breathing stopped, the whispers started. A few nurses moved quickly to fetch the sacred oils, but the physician rushed to the bedside, intent on getting to work before anyone else could see too much. This wasn't his first time hearing rumors about the king's body. Court staff had traded jokes for years, always careful to keep their voices down. Some called it a curse, a family misfortune that could only be hinted at with raised eyebrows and nervous glances. When the physician finally lifted the king's nightshirt, it was with a sense of dread, not curiosity. He'd heard stories from his predecessor and from the nurses who'd caught glimpses during past illnesses. The truth was, nobody really wanted to see what made Ferdinand different. For the royal family, any physical abnormality wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. It threatened the very idea that the king was chosen by fate or by God. Maria Cristina watched the physician closely. As Ferdinand's wife, she understood better than anyone what the court tried to hide. Her anxiety was real and private, recorded in the careful language of her correspondence. She clutched her rosary, as if prayer alone could keep the secret from spilling out. The palace had always run on secrets, and this was one that could never leave the velvet-draped walls. So what exactly made Ferdinand's anatomy so strange? It wasn't the scars from battle or illness. Those were expected. The problem was much more private, and so unusual that doctors argued quietly about it for years. Some called it the sign of a doomed lineage, something never written in the medical books, but passed around in whispers. The palace filled with tension as word began to spread. Was it a curse? In those days, people blamed everything on curses: bad weather, sick children, and now a king's body. The problem with royal secrets is they rarely stay hidden. A stray look or a nervous word, and soon the palace kitchens were buzzing with new jokes. Pages repeated what they heard to stable hands, and by morning, half of Madrid had heard that the king's body was not what it should have been. Did you hear? They say the king wasn't a real man at all. He was a monster under those robes. Was it true? Only a handful of people knew, and none of them were eager to risk their necks by talking. Those closest to Ferdinand weren't surprised. His confessor once told a fellow priest that the king's body was proof that pride invites punishment. An older lady-in-waiting claimed she'd seen Ferdinand's own mother cross herself whenever he walked by. Even in private, the royal family spoke in code. If Ferdinand's name came up, a heavy silence usually followed. Hiding a secret like this was never easy, especially when the future of the monarchy depended on producing an heir. Every time a new queen arrived, the servants took bets on how long it would take her to realize why so many court doctors made late-night visits. Ferdinand's first wife, barely more than a child, wrote home in code about her fear of the royal bedchamber. "The moon is wrong," she wrote, now understood as a desperate hint about her husband's condition. After Ferdinand's death, the physician's job was to preserve the body for public viewing. This wasn't just about tradition, it was about controlling the story. If news of the king's physical difference got out, it wouldn't just be embarrassing, It could undermine the legitimacy of the monarchy. People in 19th century Spain believed in omens and curses, and a king with a monstrous body was just the sort of sign that could unsettle the entire country. The physician and his aides used every trick they knew: vinegar and camphor to fight the smell, careful wrapping to disguise any odd shapes, and strict orders to keep everyone else away. Even priests were kept at a distance, under the excuse that the king required peace. The rumors, of course, didn't stop at the palace. News spread quickly in a country already obsessed with the king's awkward marriages and lack of heirs. If the king couldn't produce a child, maybe there was a reason, people whispered in taverns. Maybe he wasn't a proper man at all. Each retelling made the story stranger. The king with too much or not enough. The king with a curse so terrible that even the priests looked away. The physician, doing his best to act professionally, took notes that he hoped would never see daylight. Later historians and medical experts have tried to piece together what he found. Some suggest Ferdinand suffered from a rare disorder, perhaps hypospadias or something even more severe, that left him unable to function as most men did. The official notes, locked away in palace archives, mention only an uncommon malformation. The Queen made sure nothing more specific was ever written down. The process of preserving Ferdinand's body turned into a masterclass in royal cover-ups. Extra cloth and padding were used to hide anything that might spark new gossip. Guards stood by, not to protect the body from thieves, but to keep out anyone who might see too much. The official portraits showed a peaceful, dignified Ferdinand, but the reality was far less reassuring. The real fear wasn't grave robbers or political enemies. It was that someone would discover the truth behind the dynasty's most persistent rumor. This wasn't just an embarrassing secret. Ferdinand's anatomy became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Spain's royal line, a walking reminder that generations of bad decisions could catch up with even the most powerful families. The doctors finished their work, the chamber emptied, and the secret was buried with the king. But in the minds of everyone who mattered, the question lingered: how did things get so bad in the first place? If you want to understand how Ferdinand VII ended up with a medical file that made even palace doctors sweat, you have to start with the Habsburg family's approach to marriage. Forget romance. For the Habsburgs, the family tree was less about branching out and more about looping back. Their idea of a successful wedding was one that kept the royal blood as concentrated as possible, even if that meant the guest list looked suspiciously like last year's. It wasn't just the occasional cousin marriage, either. Between 1450 and 1750, genealogical records show that the average kinship coefficient in the Habsburg dynasty reached 0.0628, which is even higher than what you'd find in a typical first cousin marriage. And if you want hard numbers, 39.7% of Habsburg marriages were between people more closely related than first cousins. Nearly 20% were closer than an uncle-niece pairing. That's not a typo. That's just how the Habsburgs did business. Why would anyone do this? Simple. Power. Every marriage was a chess move, designed to keep land, titles, and influence from slipping into the hands of outsiders. If you could marry your niece and keep a rival kingdom in the family, that was a win. It was a system that worked, until it didn't. The cost of all this inbreeding was a slow but steady buildup of genetic problems. The Habsburgs became a living experiment in what happens when you ignore the basic rules of biology for the sake of politics. You've probably heard jokes about the Habsburg jaw, that famous chin you see in old portraits, jutting out so far it could double as a shelf. But the jaw was just the most visible sign of a much deeper problem. Charles II of Spain, for example, had a jaw so pronounced he could barely chew or speak. But the issues didn't stop at the chin. There were infant deaths, mysterious illnesses, and royals who struggled with everything from epilepsy to infertility. By the late 1700s, the family's health problems were impossible to ignore. Ferdinand VII's branch of the family took this to a new level. His own parents were first cousins, and in his family, first cousins married twice over. Even his 4 marriages followed the same pattern. Each bride was a close relative, handpicked from the short list of eligible Habsburgs and Bourbons. The result wasn't just awkward family dinners. It meant that, by the time Ferdinand was born, he carried a genetic legacy that was already showing cracks. The numbers tell the story. The Habsburgs' inbreeding coefficient didn't just spike once, and then fade away. It stayed high for centuries, generation after generation. Each new cousin's marriage added another layer to the problem. The result was what scientists call inbreeding depression, a fancy way of saying that when you keep mixing the same genes, the odds of bad traits showing up go through the roof. Babies died young, adults got sick, and everyone pretended not to notice that the royal nursery was always quieter than it should have been. People in the palace noticed, though. Servants whispered about the family curse. Doctors kept quiet notes about each new baby's odd features or unexplained illnesses. By the time Ferdinand was a teenager, the medical staff had already started sharing warnings behind closed doors. This wasn't just another case of the Habsburg jaw. The anomalies they found in Ferdinand were so unusual that they didn't have polite names for them, and the descriptions that survived are enough to make anyone wince. Some of these records ended up in the Vatican archives, where they were less likely to become tabloid fodder. One court physician described Ferdinand's condition in clinical terms. His Royal Highness is afflicted with a number of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar forms that intimate relations may prove challenging. Another was less formal, writing, "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." If you think palace gossip had to exaggerate, you'd be wrong. The truth was already stranger than fiction. It wasn't just about one odd feature. The problem was that Ferdinand's body was a patchwork of centuries of bad decisions. His physical condition was the result of generations of inbreeding, each one stacking the genetic odds against him. By the time he reached adulthood, Ferdinand was more than just a king. He was living proof that you can only bend the rules of nature so far before they snap back. The court painters did what they could to hide the worst of it. Official portraits smoothed out jaws, brightened eyes, and erased anything that might look out of place. But servants and doctors saw the truth. Ferdinand's inheritance wasn't just a big chin or a sickly complexion. It was a body that didn't work the way a king was supposed to, and everyone in the palace knew it. The gossip never really stopped. Every new queen, handpicked from the same shallow gene pool, eventually discovered why the palace doctors were always hovering nearby. Servants placed bets on how long it would take each bride to realize the truth. No one ever talked about it openly, but the family closed ranks, blamed bad luck, and hoped for a miracle that never came. Out in the streets, the rumors took on a life of their own. People whispered that the king was his own uncle 3 times over. Stories spread about royal children who never learned to walk or talk, princes who collapsed at the slightest stress, and queens who left the palace looking more anxious than when they arrived. The official story was always one of dignity and tradition, but behind closed doors, the reality was much messier. For Ferdinand, this legacy shaped every part of his life. It wasn't just about awkward family trees or medical oddities. His body became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Habsburg line. The royal family's decision to keep power close had created a dynasty that was fragile, secretive, and desperate to hide the truth. Ferdinand wasn't just unlucky. He was the final chapter in a story that had been building for centuries. The palace could try to cover up the details, but the tension was always there, just beneath the surface. And as Ferdinand grew up within those walls, every sideways glance and whispered joke reminded him that royal blood came with a price. Growing up as Ferdinand VII meant living in a palace where every hallway echoed with secrets and every room felt like a stage for someone else's amusement. From the earliest days, Ferdinand's life wasn't about privilege or comfort. It was about scrutiny. Servants bowed as he passed, but as soon as he was out of sight, the whispers started up again. The palace wasn't a safe haven. It was a place where every glance could cut, and every laugh behind a hand was probably about him. Even as a child, Ferdinand learned that he was different, and not in a way anyone envied. His earliest memories were shaped by the strange way adults seemed to pause their conversations when he entered, or how nannies would lower their voices, shooting nervous looks at each other. The sense of being watched crept in early, and it never left. By the time he could walk, he realized the palace was less of a home and more of a fishbowl. Everyone, servants, tutors, even other royal children, seemed to be waiting to see if the rumors about him were true. In most royal families, a child with a problem might be hidden away, shielded from the worst of the court's attention. Not in Ferdinand's world. In Spain's palace, he became the main attraction. Older pages dared each other to sneak a look or listen in on the doctor's hushed conversations. The cruel curiosity wasn't limited to adults. Even the palace children picked up on it, turning Ferdinand's differences into the palace's favorite running joke. If the kids were bad, the adults were worse. Ferdinand's father, Charles IV, was more interested in hunting than in raising his son. He'd rather spend days in the countryside with his dogs than deal with the awkwardness at court. When he did show up, he often seemed embarrassed by Ferdinand, keeping their interactions brief and avoiding introducing him to important guests. His mother, Maria Luisa, added her own chaos to the mix. She put more trust in her lover, Manuel de Godoy, than in her own son, and her open affair was just another reminder to Ferdinand that loyalty was a word for other people. In this environment, the young prince learned about betrayal and distance before he even learned to read. Humiliation wasn't a rare event for Ferdinand. It was baked into daily palace life. Inside jokes about the prince floated through the halls. Servants made bets about how many steps he'd limp on a given day, or whether the doctor would appear with the box, a mysterious collection of medical supplies no one dared mention aloud. When Ferdinand tripped in the courtyard, the servants looked away, but the gossips started immediately. One diary from the time called it a cruel amusement, never out of season. The only person who never found it funny was Ferdinand himself. Ferdinand noticed everything. He wasn't oblivious. He was hyper-aware. During lessons, he'd linger at the edge of the room, watching the servants who seemed to be cleaning the same spot for the third time, listening for the snicker that might cost someone their job. Tutors expected a model pupil, and got someone who learned quickly, but only the lesson of distrust. If a servant was caught laughing or whispering, they might be dismissed by nightfall. Over time, the staff learned to be more careful, but the jokes just moved out of earshot. The real lesson was that the consequences were real, and Ferdinand was always watching. The gossip didn't stay locked inside the palace. Word spread through Madrid like wildfire. Market vendors, bakers, and beggars all whispered about the Spanish embarrassment. Even foreign diplomats reported back home about the prince's odd reputation. Letters from the British and French legations are full of sarcasm and speculation, wondering what exactly made the Spanish so convinced their prince would never be fit to rule. Local cartoonists, picking up on the rumors, drew exaggerated images of royal bad luck, giant chins, hidden lower halves, and dark clouds hovering over the palace. These cartoons ended up in taverns, fueling the city's appetite for gossip. The family drama only made things worse. Maria Luisa's affair with Godoy was an open secret, and Ferdinand grew up watching his mother's loyalty shift away from her family. The palace was a constant battleground of jealousy, threats, and whispered betrayals. At night, the sounds of arguments and slammed doors echoed through the halls. Ferdinand's earliest lessons were about survival, not trust. Every relationship was a transaction, not a comfort. Adolescence brought no relief. If anything, the pressure increased. Ferdinand became more aware of the jokes and the sideways glances. He started to change, growing secretive and quick-tempered. Tutors noticed his new habits, vindictiveness, dismissing servants for small mistakes, punishing with harsh words or outright threats. If someone crossed him, they risked more than just a scolding. Servants began to tiptoe around him, knowing that his power to control their fate was growing. This pattern wasn't just a phase, it was a defense mechanism. Psychological studies today would call it a response to chronic bullying and isolation. Ferdinand, powerless over his own body and the court's ridicule, learned to push back in the only way he could, by controlling those around him. The most telling example comes from a court chaplain's memoir. When a young page accidentally saw the prince undressed, Ferdinand had the boy flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. It wasn't enough to punish the boy. Ferdinand had to make sure no one else would ever risk seeing his shame. The message was clear. The prince's humiliation would never go unpunished. Adults in the palace watched these incidents and began to keep their distance. Servants who seemed too curious about the royal problem were transferred elsewhere. New maids were warned. Don't stare, don't ask questions, don't linger. Over time, only the most cautious employees dared approach Ferdinand. The palace became a place where paranoia grew alongside the prince. Isolation didn't bring Ferdinand any peace. Diaries and letters from the time describe him wandering the palace gardens alone, refusing company and avoiding conversation. He had no real friends, only handlers. Visiting children learned quickly not to make eye contact or ask questions if they saw Ferdinand reading alone. Even the palace dogs were chosen for their quietness. Years later, staff would say that even the dogs knew not to make noise around the prince. The dysfunction at home wrapped around Ferdinand like a heavy cloak. His mother spent her time with Godoy, while his father escaped to the woods whenever possible. The only lessons Ferdinand absorbed were about secrets, betrayal, and the dangers of trust. Power struggles broke out constantly, and the young prince learned that being vulnerable was a risk he couldn't afford. By the time Ferdinand was old enough to think about his future as king, suspicion was second nature. Years of ridicule and loneliness didn't make him softer. They made him sharper, more guarded, and resentful. The shame he felt as a child turned into a need for control. The jokes and rumors that once made him shrink away became the fuel for his anger. When he finally reached the throne, he had no interest in forgiveness or trust. Instead, he ruled with the same cruelty and suspicion he'd learned in the palace halls. Ferdinand's childhood wasn't just a sad story about a lonely prince. It was the foundation for everything that came next. The constant humiliation, the betrayals, and the endless cycle of rumors shaped him into a ruler who saw threats everywhere. In a palace built on secrets, Ferdinand learned to trust no one, not even himself. And when he finally had real power, he used it to make sure that no one would ever laugh at him again. For Ferdinand, The real lesson of childhood was simple. If you can't control your own body, you control everything else. Inside the walls of Spain's royal palace, paranoia wasn't just a passing mood, it was the air everyone breathed. Ferdinand VII's reign turned the palace into a place where suspicion ruled, and every detail of daily life was shaped by the king's private fears. The grand halls and velvet curtains were just a backdrop for a far more intense drama. A ruler convinced that danger lurked behind every smile, every whisper, and every closed door. Ferdinand didn't just worry in silence. He built his anxiety into the very structure of the palace. He ordered hidden passageways to be constructed, the kind that let him, or his spies, move unseen, listening in on conversations, or keeping tabs on servants and ministers. Mirrors were mounted at odd angles in corridors, not as decoration but as early warning systems. If you caught your own reflection unexpectedly, you might also catch the king's eye, watching from somewhere you didn't expect. This wasn't just about keeping out assassins. It was about making sure that no joke, no rumor, and no hint of his private shame could escape his notice. The surveillance didn't stop with architecture. Ferdinand employed a sprawling network of spies whose only job was to listen, report, and root out any sign of disrespect. Their ears were tuned to every corner of the palace. Chapel, kitchens, gardens. No space was off limits. If a servant chuckled too loudly, if a minister lingered too long after a meeting, if a courtier dared to mention the queen's name in the wrong tone, a report would find its way to the king's desk. Ferdinand was especially obsessed with anything related to his marriage. The idea that someone might be whispering about his relationship with Maria Cristina, or worse, about what happened or didn't happen, in their private chambers, kept him up at night. Every rumor had to be tracked down and stamped out before it could reach the streets of Madrid. Even the most innocent requests were suspect. When Maria Cristina asked to redecorate her rooms, Ferdinand didn't see a queen wanting new wallpaper. He saw a plot to hide weapons or poison, maybe even secret messages from foreign enemies. Compliments directed at the queen became suspicious. A simple, "Her Majesty looks well today," could be twisted into evidence of a secret affair or a coded insult. Not even the palace's religious life was safe. If a priest hesitated during mass or a confessor cast a nervous glance, Ferdinand wondered if a conspiracy was brewing behind the altar. The king's mind turned every detail into a potential threat. This constant suspicion didn't just make life difficult for the people around him. It changed the way the court worked. Ferdinand introduced loyalty tests that made everyone uneasy. In private meetings, he'd make a statement, then contradict himself minutes later, just to see who would correct him. If you pointed out the mistake, you were marked as untrustworthy. If you stayed silent, you might be safe for now. But the king never forgot a face. Ministers learned to speak in circles, using vague phrases and coded language to avoid saying anything that could be used against them. Eye contact became dangerous. A careless word could mean exile or worse. The palace became a maze, both physically and socially. The hidden passageways behind the walls were mirrored by a complicated set of unspoken rules and shifting alliances among the people who worked there. Ministers stopped offering real advice and started focusing on survival. Letters were written in code, meetings were filled with non-committal answers, and everyone learned to keep their real opinions to themselves. The wrong joke, a sideways glance, or a comment taken out of context could land you in a cell or sent to a distant post in the countryside. Ferdinand's policies outside the palace reflected his inner turmoil. He poured resources into palace security, not to protect against foreign enemies, but to monitor his own people. He set up special squads to sniff out gossip and punish anyone caught spreading rumors. Censorship of newspapers and books became more intense. Reports on palace gossip were read aloud at royal dinners, turning private anxieties into public spectacles. The king's personal fears spilled over into punishments that affected the whole country. He ordered public floggings for people caught making jokes about the palace. Homes were watched, families marked, and even small towns were told to report any disrespectful talk about the royal family. Priests and nuns, who were usually safe from royal wrath, found themselves under scrutiny if they said the wrong thing. In this climate, people learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. The safest conversation was no conversation at all. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ferdinand issued new rules about who could go where and when, changing the daily routines of everyone who lived or worked there. One week, a certain corridor was off limits. The next, a new set of greeting phrases was required for anyone who met the king. Mirrors were positioned so Ferdinand could watch people's faces as they entered a room, searching for the slightest sign of disrespect. Even the way a court painter depicted the king's mouth in a portrait could be used as evidence of disloyalty. No place was safe from Ferdinand's suspicion, not even the royal chapel. Agents watched the priests, noting who looked nervous and who seemed too comfortable. Ministers left church glancing over their shoulders, worried that a misplaced sigh or a poorly timed prayer could end up in a secret report. The king's paranoia shaped every detail of court life, turning ordinary routines into tests of loyalty. This wasn't just bad luck or a personal quirk. Ferdinand's private anxieties warped the entire culture of the palace, and by extension, the country. His need to control every rumor, every look, every word became the defining feature of his reign. The connection between his humiliation and the harsh policies he imposed was obvious to anyone paying attention. The more he tried to bury his secret, the more it shaped the world around him. People outside the palace adapted to the new reality. Ministers copied the king's loyalty tests at home, and even shopkeepers posted "no politics" signs to keep out trouble. Neighbors closed their curtains, and children learned not to joke about the king, even in whispers. Ferdinand's paranoia spread like a shadow, touching every corner of Spanish life. The result was a palace where trust was impossible and fear was constant. Ferdinand's efforts to control his image only made him more isolated. He built walls, both real and imagined, and made suspicion of the law of the land. The palace that should have been the center of power became a place where everyone was afraid to speak, afraid to act, and, above all, afraid to be noticed. And yet, behind all these layers of surveillance and suspicion, the king's greatest fear never left him. The real challenge wasn't just keeping the court in line. It was facing the realities waiting behind closed doors, where power, biology, and royal expectations collided in ways that no amount of paranoia could prevent. Royal weddings are supposed to be magical. At least, that's the myth. In Ferdinand VII's palace, romance was replaced by dread. If you asked anyone who worked behind those velvet curtains, they'd tell you the king's marriages were less about love and more about survival. The bedchamber wasn't a place for fairy tales. It was where hope went to die, one wedding night at a time. Take Maria Antonia, Ferdinand's first bride. She arrived in Madrid with dreams of royal happiness, only to find herself facing a scene that belonged in a medical textbook, not a love story. The wedding suite was set up with custom-made cushions, jars of oils, and implements that looked suspiciously like surgical tools. There was no gentle explanation, just the palace doctor laying out the facts in the coldest terms possible. Maria Antonia was handed laudanum before she even had a chance to protest. The reality hit her fast. This was not a normal marriage, and what was expected of her was something no one had prepared her for. The real shock was Ferdinand's condition. Even the doctors called it an anatomical monstrosity. Maria Antonia's first night as queen was less about starting a family and more about surviving a trauma. The psychological fallout was immediate. She wrote desperate letters home, describing nights spent numb from the laudanum and days spent trying to avoid the king's bed. Instead of a partnership, their marriage became a cycle of medical procedures and failed attempts, each one more humiliating than the last. Word spread quickly. The palace staff talked in hushed voices about special restraints designed to keep Maria Antonia in position, as if intimacy was a medical operation. The queen's growing dependence on laudanum became a subject of gossip, and the king's mood soured with every failed attempt to produce an heir. Ferdinand's anxiety and paranoia deepened. He started listening for whispers, convinced that everyone in the palace was laughing at him behind closed doors. The king's desperation led to increasingly bizarre solutions. Astrologers, mystics, and miracle workers paraded through the palace, each promising to break the so-called curse. Some claimed that Ferdinand's condition was a sign of mystical blessing, a dragon's rod, while others prescribed rituals, potions, and ceremonies that would be laughable if they weren't so sad. The palace became a circus of quackery, with bottles of mysterious liquids and scraps of ritual paper turning up in every corner. Maria Antonia's suffering didn't go unnoticed. Her health declined. She grew anxious and withdrawn, her letters home becoming more frantic and coded. The palace responded with more treatments, but nothing helped. The marriage, already doomed, became a public spectacle. Every failed night was another story for the servants and another reason for the king to distrust everyone around him. When Maria Antonia died young, the court barely had time to mourn before Ferdinand was pressured into a second marriage. This time, the bride was his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal. You might think the palace would have learned something, but the nightmare only deepened. The wedding night was so traumatic that screams echoed through the palace corridors. Maria Isabel emerged from the ordeal a changed person, jumpy, stuttering, and visibly shaken. Her trauma became obvious to everyone, but Ferdinand's reaction was to clamp down even harder. He intercepted her letters, searched her rooms, and demanded constant updates from the physicians. The palace atmosphere grew even more tense. With every movement and word watched for signs of betrayal or failure. The cycle repeated. Each new queen arrived with hope and left with scars. Ferdinand's paranoia infected everything. Ministers became suspects. Friends of the queen were interrogated. Even the family priest started to look uneasy. The palace was no longer just a home. It was a pressure cooker, where every failed attempt at intimacy was dissected, documented, and whispered about in every hallway. By the time Ferdinand married Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the process had lost any pretense of romance. Everything was scheduled, clinical, and cold. The queen kept detailed notes about each attempt at intimacy, as if she were a nurse recording symptoms. Doctors hovered nearby, ready to intervene. Ferdinand, now convinced his wife, was documenting his secret for foreign spies, spent nights pacing the windows, watching for signs of betrayal. The marriage became another exercise in humiliation, with both partners trapped by duty and fear. When Maria Josepha finally became pregnant, the palace erupted in hope. But the hope was short-lived. Complications started early, and when the time came, Ferdinand insisted on supervising the delivery himself, despite having no medical training. The child, a daughter, died soon after birth, and Maria Josepha died 3 weeks later from childbed fever and despair. The tragedy was complete. All the rituals, the gadgets, the desperate prayers, none of it changed the outcome. The palace halls grew quieter, but the sense of doom only deepened. Ferdinand's final marriage, to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, was even more farcical. She was visibly pregnant at the wedding, and everyone knew the child was not Ferdinand's. But at this point, the king was too desperate to care. Spain needed an heir, and Ferdinand was willing to accept any solution, no matter how humiliating. The marriage was built on a lie, and Ferdinand's paranoia reached new heights. He ordered constant surveillance of his wife and the court, convinced that conspiracies were everywhere. The emotional cost of these marriages was staggering. Maria Antonia faded into addiction and depression. Maria Isabel never recovered from her trauma. Maria Josepha's brief hope ended in death. Maria Cristina lived in constant fear of being exposed. Each queen left behind her own trail of heartbreak, and the palace filled with coded letters, secret warnings, and stories of monstrous duties that no one dared to say out loud. The bedchamber, meant to be a place of hope for the dynasty, became the heart of its misery. Every attempt to fix the problem, whether through medicine, superstition, or sheer force, only made things worse. The pressure to produce an heir turned private suffering into public spectacle, and the king's anxiety infected everyone around him. With each failed marriage, the walls of the palace seemed to close in a little tighter. Ferdinand's personal nightmare became a national crisis, and the stories of those nights still echo through Spain's history. The royal family's desperate search for a solution, no matter how strange or humiliating, set the stage for what came next. A new round of schemes, rituals, and promises, all aimed at breaking the curse that haunted the Spanish throne. When a royal line is on the brink and the whole country is watching, the pressure to produce an heir turns into something bigger than family drama. It becomes a national spectacle. For Ferdinand VII, the quest for a son wasn't just a private matter, it was a public obsession. The palace became a strange mix of clinic, shrine, and theater, where science and superstition collided, and everyone, from the lowest servant to the most decorated doctor, was enlisted in the cause. If you think modern fertility struggles are stressful, try being a king whose every failure is headline news. Ferdinand's options ran out fast. There wasn't much privacy in the palace, and there was even less patience. The doctors had already tried their best. Consultations with the top physicians from Paris and Vienna, endless examinations, and a parade of newfangled medical devices that looked more like torture instruments than anything else. Every time a new expert arrived, the palace buzzed with hope. Maybe this one would have the answer. But the results were always the same. Awkward silences, more prescriptions, and a growing sense of dread. The medical efforts got creative, and not in a good way. Ferdinand choked down potions that smelled like mold and tasted worse. He drank tonics made from roots, herbs, and animal parts, anything that promised to restore vigor. One doctor insisted on donkey milk, another on powdered deer antler. The third tried to convince the king that bathing in ice-cold water would shock his body into compliance. The king endured it all, desperate for results. But every remedy ended with the same disappointment and a little more humiliation. When science failed, superstition took over. The palace filled up with astrologers, mystics, and self-proclaimed miracle workers. Each brought their own rituals and a new list of things to try. There were midnight ceremonies with candles and incense, prayers whispered in Latin, and elaborate dances around the royal bed. One astrologer claimed that sleeping with amethyst under the pillow and reciting a specific psalm would guarantee a child. Ferdinand tried it, only to complain that the stone gave him headaches and the chanting left his throat raw. The real spectacle wasn't just the rituals themselves, but how seriously everyone took them. Ministers, courtiers, and servants all played along, whether they believed or not. Refusing to participate could mean losing a job or worse. There's a story about a night when the entire palace staff was ordered to arrange flowers in a specific pattern on the queen's pillow, convinced it would break the curse. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, barking at shadows as the rituals dragged on into the early morning. The queen, for her part, had little choice but to go along. She swallowed bitter seeds, wore strange amulets sewn into her gowns, and endured endless ritual baths. Each time a new remedy failed, the blame shifted. Maybe the queen's hair was too long, so it was cut. Maybe the sheets were the wrong color, so they were changed. Every detail became a matter of life and death, and the queen's health suffered under the constant pressure. Outside the palace, word spread quickly. Madrid's streets are filled with rumors. Healers and charlatans from all over Spain descended on the city, offering their own cures. Dried lizards, lucky stones, bottles of colored liquid. The palace even set up an official desk of miracles to handle the flood of gifts and advice from hopeful subjects. It wasn't just a royal problem anymore. It was a national fixation. Every failed attempt brought a new round of schemes. The servants kept lists of which foods the king had eaten, which side of the bed he'd slept on, and what prayers had been said. If Ferdinand sneezed, someone blamed the kitchen. If the queen tripped, the carpets were replaced. The palace spent more money on candles, oils, and imported herbs than on the army, and still nothing worked. The spectacle grew. Palace records show that astrologers came and went, each leaving behind a new ritual or a new warning. Some insisted on burning specific herbs at specific times, others on drawing chalk symbols under the bed. One even demanded that the king avoid walking through a certain doorway after sunset. The staff, caught between hope and fear, obeyed every order, no matter how strange. Meanwhile, the doctors kept trying. Some historians believe the palace even experimented with early versions of medical devices designed to stimulate the king's body. The records are vague, but there are hints of contraptions involving suction, pressure, and even mild electrical currents. The king submitted to it all, his desperation overriding his dignity. The doctors, for their part, signed off on treatments they knew wouldn't work, afraid to risk their careers by refusing the king's wishes. The queen's suffering only deepened. Each failed pregnancy brought more rituals, more medicines, and more blame. She was expected to keep a detailed diary of every symptom, every meal, every dream. If she cried, it was seen as a bad omen. If she smiled, it was suspicious. The pressure was relentless, and her health deteriorated with every failed attempt. The palace became a place where hope and humiliation lived side by side. Every new remedy brought a flicker of optimism, only to be snuffed out by another disappointment. The king grew more anxious and erratic, waking the palace at all hours to demand new solutions. The queen became more withdrawn, her letters home filled with coded pleas for help. Even the court painters got pulled into the madness. Ferdinand ordered that no unlucky symbols, no moons, no stars, appear in any portraits. He scrutinized every detail, convinced that a misplaced brushstroke could doom his chances. The artists complied, painting over anything that might bring bad luck, and the portraits became bland, lifeless images of a king and queen weighed down by invisible burdens. The national mood soured. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about the madhouse atmosphere at court, where learned men and charlatans chased the same impossible goal. The palace, once a symbol of power, became a punchline. The king's desperation was no longer a secret. It was the talk of Europe. In the end, no amount of science, superstition, or spectacle delivered the air Spain needed. The royal treasury was lighter. The palace was filled with the debris of failed rituals, and the king and queen were left more isolated than ever. The servants whispered about curses and bad luck, but the real tragedy was much simpler. All the power and money in the world couldn't fix what was broken. As the years dragged on, the king's disappointment hardened into something darker. The relentless failure to secure an heir didn't just haunt the royal bedroom. It started to seep into every corner of palace life, changing the way Ferdinand saw himself and everyone around him. And when private shame turns toxic, it doesn't stay private for long. Ferdinand VI's reign is what happens when private shame starts writing the rules for an entire country. The king's personal struggles didn't stay locked away in the royal bedroom. They leaked into every corner of public life, shaping Spain's laws, its culture, and even how people spoke to each other. The Anatomy of Cruelty, how physical shame became public policy, isn't just a catchy title. It's a description of how one man's anxieties warped a nation. Let's talk about the palace first. You might think royal palaces are about luxury and comfort, but under Ferdinand, the place turned into a fortress of suspicion. Hidden passageways snaked through the walls. Mirrors popped up in odd places. not for decoration, but so the king, or his spies, could catch a glimpse of anyone whispering. Guards were everywhere. The king's physical condition became the lens through which he saw every threat, real or imagined. If you've ever felt paranoid after an embarrassing moment, imagine having the power to redesign a palace to suit your fears. The web of suspicion didn't end at the palace doors. Ferdinand's obsession with secrecy and control shaped his policies from the ground up. He poured money into a sprawling spy network, hiring informants to monitor not just his ministers but the cooks, the gardeners, and anyone else who might overhear a joke or spot something odd. The budget for surveillance grew, while the country's real problems, like poverty and unrest, got pushed aside. Spain's coffers were drained to pay for secret police and loyalty investigations, all to make sure that no one dared mention the king's most sensitive secret. Freedom of speech? Forget it. Ferdinand brought back the Inquisition, turning it into a tool for rooting out sexual slander and rumors about the crown. If someone whispered about the king's health, or even made a harmless joke, they could find themselves hauled in front of a tribunal. The Inquisition's reach extended far beyond heresy and blasphemy. It was now the king's personal rumor police. Markets, taverns, even church pews became places where people watched their words, afraid that the wrong comment could land them in a dungeon. It's one thing to be embarrassed about a personal issue. It's another to build an entire legal system to punish anyone who dares to mention it. Inside the palace, the tension was constant. Servants learned to keep their faces blank and their laughter silent. Ministers stopped talking about anything except the weather or the price of grain. Even a compliment could be twisted into an insult if it landed the wrong way. Ferdinand's paranoia meant that everyone had to play along, pretending not to notice the king's anxieties while living in fear of sudden punishment. The atmosphere was so heavy that even the smallest slip, a sideways glance, a muffled giggle, could have serious consequences. The king's obsession with secrecy led to some truly bizarre practices. Loyalty tests became routine. Ministers and officials were forced to sign oaths, answer questions about their private beliefs, and report on their colleagues. If someone was suspected of disloyalty, they could be exiled, demoted, or worse. The result was a government where everyone watched their backs, and nobody trusted anyone else. The king's personal insecurity became the organizing principle of Spanish politics. The costs of all this suspicion were huge. Money that could have gone to schools, roads, or famine relief was spent on spies and secret passages. The economic crisis deepened, but the king wouldn't cut the surveillance budget. When provinces begged for help during crop failures, the palace responded by sending more investigators to root out subversive talk. The message was clear. Protecting the king's image mattered more than helping his people. Censorship was everywhere. Newspapers were edited, rewritten, or shut down if they strayed too close to forbidden topics. Books disappeared from shelves, replaced by bland, approved histories. Even private letters were intercepted and read for signs of disrespect. Families learned to avoid politics at the dinner table, and shopkeepers put up signs warning customers not to discuss the crown. The effect was chilling. People stopped speaking freely, not just about the king, but about anything that might be seen as criticism. The church wasn't safe either. Priests who preached about mercy or forgiveness, instead of loyalty to the crown, were reassigned or silenced. Religious festivals were monitored for signs of dissent. Even confessions became dangerous. What you said to a priest could end up in a report to the palace. The king's paranoia seeped into every institution, turning trust into a liability. Ferdinand's policies didn't just target political enemies. Ordinary people bore the brunt of his fear. A merchant who laughed at the wrong time could lose his business. A schoolteacher who used the wrong word could be dismissed or worse. Entire villages learned to keep quiet, erasing words like curse or weakness from their vocabularies. The Inquisition's methods left scars, both physical and psychological, on communities across Spain. No one was safe from suspicion, not even the king's closest allies. Servants who tried too hard to defend Ferdinand's honor found themselves under scrutiny. A cook who served the wrong dish, a guard who lingered in the wrong hallway, a secretary who wrote too quickly or too slowly. Anyone could be accused of knowing too much or not being loyal enough. The palace became a place where loyalty was a trap, and the safest thing to do was keep your head down and hope not to be noticed. Rebellion and unrest were inevitable. When people finally pushed back, whether over taxes, famine, or basic rights, the king's answer was always the same. More crackdowns, more surveillance, harsher punishments. Protesters disappeared, families were relocated, and whole regions fell under suspicion. Instead of addressing real problems, Ferdinand doubled down on control, making the kingdom even more brittle and isolated. The irony is hard to miss. The more Ferdinand tried to protect himself, the more exposed he became. His efforts to stamp out rumors only made them spread faster. Ministers who tried to offer real advice were replaced by yes-men, leaving the king in an echo chamber of his own making. The palace, once a symbol of power, became a haunted house filled with empty rooms, locked doors, and nervous glances. The damage wasn't just political or economic. The real cost was in the way fear became a fact of daily life. Spain's decline accelerated as resources vanished into the black hole of royal anxiety. Progress stalled, rebellion simmered, and the country's best minds learned to keep their ideas to themselves. Ferdinand's private shame set off a chain reaction of cruelty and repression that lasted long after his reign ended. And while the king built walls around his secret, the people closest to him suffered the most. The policies he created didn't just shape the nation, they shaped the lives of those who lived behind the palace walls. The consequences of his fear played out in the quietest corners of the court, in the faces of those who had no choice but to play their part in the king's lonely drama. Royal portraits love to lie. They show queens wrapped in silk and pearls, faces calm, hands folded, every detail meant to signal control and luxury. The reality of being married to Ferdinand VII was nothing like the paintings. Behind the velvet curtains, the queens of Spain lived out a story of pressure, pain, and isolation, a story that left them broken, both in body and spirit. This throne didn't just haunt the king, it haunted every woman who sat beside him. Start with Maria Antonia, Ferdinand's first wife, a teenager sent from Naples to cement a political alliance. She arrived in Madrid hoping for a new chapter, maybe even a little happiness. Instead, she found herself in a palace where her husband's medical problems were the stuff of whispered legend. The wedding night was less about romance and more about endurance. Doctors hovered nearby with custom-made cushions, oils, and instructions. Maria Antonia's letters home started out hopeful, then turned frantic as she failed to deliver the one thing the court cared about, a healthy heir. After 2 miscarriages and endless nights of forced remedies and laudanum, her health crumbled. Some suspected poison, but what really finished her was the relentless pressure and loneliness. At 21, Maria Antonia was dead, another casualty of royal expectations. You'd think the palace might learn something, but the cycle just repeated. Maria Isabel of Portugal, the second queen, was chosen for her lineage and her womb, nothing more. She walked into a marriage where failure wasn't an option. The court doubled down on weird rituals and medical interventions, hoping for a miracle. Maria Isabel managed to give birth twice, but both daughters died, one stillborn, the other in infancy. The loss broke her. Servants noticed she flinched at every sound and avoided eye contact. She withdrew from court life, and her health quickly faded. Within months, she too was gone, her funeral marked by more gossip than grief. The throne remained empty, and the palace grew colder. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony was next, a bride chosen for her family's political value and her supposed robustness. She entered a palace that felt more like a laboratory. Every aspect of her life was monitored, her cycles, her meals, her moods, even her attempts at intimacy. The pressure to produce a male heir was constant. Maria Josepha finally became pregnant, but the hope didn't last. After a difficult pregnancy, she delivered a stillborn daughter. The loss, combined with the endless scrutiny and invasive treatments, destroyed her health. She died soon after, leaving the palace staff lighting candles more out of fear than faith. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 queens, 3 tragedies, and still no heir. Each marriage became less about partnership and more about survival. Ferdinand's wives were trapped in a system that treated them as state property, their value measured only by their ability to produce sons. If they failed, the consequences were harsh: annulment, banishment, or worse. The court didn't see them as people. They were tools for dynastic ambitions, their lives reduced to medical charts and official reports. Inside the palace, the pressure never let up. Every meal was inspected, every bath supervised, every letter censored. If a queen coughed, rumors of sabotage spread. If she smiled, people wondered what she was hiding. The queens lived on a stage where every gesture was analyzed, every emotion dissected. The staff sent daily updates to ministers, and even happiness was treated with suspicion. There was no escape from the microscope. The mental toll was crushing. Maria Antonia's surviving letters read like a cry for help, bouncing between hope, fear, and resignation. Maria Isabel became so withdrawn that servants described her as haunted. Maria Josepha's brief optimism vanished under the weight of expectation and grief. Addiction to laudanum and other sedatives became common, a desperate attempt to numb the pain. Psychological abuse and isolation were part of daily life. These women weren't queens in any meaningful sense. They were prisoners in a palace that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. Ferdinand's paranoia only made things worse. Each failed marriage fed his suspicions. He started seeing betrayal everywhere. In the way a queen's maid lingered too long, in a letter written home, in a look exchanged across the dinner table. Queens who became ill or withdrawn found their servants replaced and their mail intercepted. Foreign companions were searched daily. Privacy was a fantasy. The king's spies reported on everything, and the palace atmosphere grew heavier with every new disappointment. By the time Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies became the fourth and final wife, the rules had changed, but the misery remained. She was already pregnant when she married Ferdinand, and everyone knew the child wasn't his. The court accepted this arrangement because the need for an heir had become desperate. Maria Cristina learned quickly. Keep quiet, avoid conflict, and never show weakness. Her marriage was a transaction, not a partnership, and she survived by playing her role to perfection. The queen's suffering was not just personal, it was political. Their bodies were battlegrounds for dynastic survival, their health a matter of state. The pressure to produce an heir warped every relationship, turning the palace into a place where trust was impossible and fear was constant. The queen's failures were never private. They were public disasters, dissected by ministers and gossiped about by servants. The cost of these failures was paid in funerals, addiction, and lives cut short. Modern historians still argue over Ferdinand's legacy. Was he a cruel tyrant, or just another victim of a broken system? Some say he was selfish, caring only for his own survival. Others point to the crushing expectations he faced, the centuries of inbreeding, and the impossible task of saving a dynasty doomed by its own traditions. Either way, the real losers were the women forced to endure the consequences of decisions they never made. The haunted throne of Spain became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when personal problems become public policy. The queens left behind more than just a trail of tragedy. They left a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of dynastic ambition. Their stories, hidden in diaries and whispered in the shadows of old palaces, remind us that the price of a crown is often paid by those with no choice in the matter. The pain and dysfunction that started in the royal bedchamber didn't stay there. The same pressures that broke the queens seeped out into the wider world, setting off a chain reaction that reached far beyond the palace walls. When a kingdom starts to unravel, you usually expect a big war, a dramatic invasion, or at least a villain twirling his mustache. With Ferdinand VII, the collapse wasn't about a single disaster. It was a slow-motion train wreck, with every bad decision compounding the next. A kingdom in collapse, the curse spreads, isn't just a catchy line for the history books. It's what happens when the person at the top lets his fears and obsessions run the show. Look at the state of Spain's empire during Ferdinand's reign. At the start, Spain still called itself a world power, with colonies stretching across the Americas. By the end, the map looked like a shrinking ice cube on a summer day. One by one, the Spanish colonies in the Americas broke away: Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Peru, and more. The king's response? He was so wrapped up in his private anxieties and palace drama that he barely noticed the empire slipping through his fingers. While he obsessed over loyalty tests and the latest palace rumor, entire nations declared independence and walked out the door. It wasn't just a blow to national pride. It gutted Spain's wealth. For centuries, Spanish treasure fleets had sailed home loaded with gold and silver. Now, the ships stopped coming, and the royal treasury turned into a hollow shell. The economic consequences hit fast and hard. Without the steady flow of American silver, Spain's finances dried up. The government scrambled to pay soldiers, keep the lights on in the palace, and cover the endless bills from Ferdinand's ever-growing spy network. Taverns in Madrid went quiet. Merchants closed shop, and even the king's own banquets shrank from feasts to sad, pared-down affairs. The country's debts piled up. Instead of investing in roads, schools, or anything that might actually help people, Ferdinand funneled what little money remained into policing his own population and stamping out dissent. Things only got messier in the halls of power. Ferdinand ruled through a tight-knit group of favorites, known as his Camarilla. These weren't seasoned statesmen. They were the king's personal confidants, chosen for their loyalty, not their brains. Ministers came and went at the king's whim. If someone dared to disagree or even hesitated in a meeting, they were out the door by sunset. Nobody in the government knew if they'd have a job tomorrow, so everyone played it safe, avoided tough decisions, and hoped not to be noticed. The result? Problems festered. Cities went bankrupt, farmers rioted, and the roads crumbled while the court argued over gossip and petty feuds. If you're waiting for the army to step in, you're not alone. Spain saw a wave of military uprisings or pronunciamientos as officers and liberals got fed up with the king's paranoia and incompetence. The most famous was led by Rafael del Riego in 1820. For a brief moment, the rebels forced Ferdinand to restore the liberal constitution of 1812, kicking off what's called the liberal triennium. The king played along, at least in public. Behind the scenes, he plotted to bring back absolute monarchy at the first chance. As soon as the political winds shifted, he scrapped the constitution, purged his enemies, and doubled down on repression. It was a cycle. Give a little, take a lot, and punish anyone who dared to hope for real change. The national mood went from anxious to angry. Farmers couldn't sell their crops. Merchants faced endless new taxes. Families left for the Americas, hoping to find a future that Spain no longer offered. Every month brought new protests, new crackdowns, and new rumors of rebellion. Ferdinand's answer to every crisis was more soldiers, more spies, and more silence about the real problems. He ruled by fear and superstition, convinced that every setback was a personal attack, every critic a traitor. The country became a pressure cooker, with each new law and restriction making life harder for everyone except the king's inner circle. The king's obsession with producing an heir only made things worse. He poured time and money into miracle cures, rituals, and medical experiments, all in the hope of securing the dynasty. While Ferdinand chased after miracle doctors and lucky charms, the government drifted. Laws were passed not to help the country, but to protect the king's secrets. The real business of running a nation, fixing roads, feeding people, keeping the peace, took a back seat to Ferdinand's personal anxieties. Historians don't mince words about this period. Stanley G. Payne called Ferdinand, in many ways the basest king in Spanish history. Cowardly, selfish, grasping, suspicious, and vengeful, Fernando seemed almost incapable of any perception of the Commonwealth. That's not just a harsh review. It's a summary of how one man's dysfunction can shape a whole country. Policies weren't about progress or justice. They were about calming the king's fears and keeping his secrets safe. By the end of Ferdinand's reign, Spain was a shadow of its former self. The empire was gone. The treasury was empty. The population was restless, divided, and exhausted. The king's legacy wasn't just a lost empire or a bankrupt state. It was a country haunted by suspicion, stunted by fear, and left to pick up the pieces after years of neglect. Foreign diplomats rode home in disbelief, wondering how Spain, once the envy of Europe, had fallen so far, so fast. The real tragedy is how personal pain became national trauma. Ferdinand's need to guard his secret didn't just cost him peace of mind. It cost Spain its future. The resources wasted on repression and paranoia could have rebuilt the country. Instead, they built a system where everyone was afraid to speak, to act, or even to hope. The king's haunted legacy was written not just in lost colonies and empty coffers, but in the faces of ordinary people who learned to keep their heads down and their dreams small. If you want to know what happens when a ruler's private nightmare becomes public policy, look no further than Ferdinand VII. His reign is a lesson in how power, without wisdom, can break a nation. The story of Spain's collapse isn't just about lost battles or bad luck. It's about the slow, relentless spread of fear, secrecy, and dysfunction from the palace outward. The cost wasn't just measured in gold or territory. It was measured in lost futures, broken trust, and a kingdom that forgot what it meant to lead. And as Spain tried to move on, the shadow of Ferdinand's rule lingered. The palace, the throne, and the people all carried the scars of a reign where one man's secret shaped the fate of millions. The final chapter of this story doesn't end with a revolution or a triumphant return to glory. Instead, it circles back to the place where it all began. The royal bedchamber, the locked doors, and the secret that everyone tried so hard to keep hidden. After Ferdinand VI's death in 1833, the palace staff moved quickly to preserve the king's body. But this wasn't just about royal tradition or keeping up appearances. This was about controlling the final chapter of a secret that had shaped his reign and haunted the Spanish monarchy for generations. The final secret, anatomy, autopsy, and the afterlife of a curse, isn't a dramatic exaggeration. It's the literal truth behind the locked doors of the royal crypt. The preservation process for Ferdinand was more intense than usual. Palace physicians, led by Dr. Francisco Flores, worked behind closed doors, with guards posted in the corridors and extra curtains drawn. The staff whispered about the reason for the secrecy, but nobody dared ask questions. The king's death might have ended his rule, but it started a new kind of tension. The real challenge wasn't just making the king look presentable for public mourning. It was making sure that the anatomical monstrosity that had defined his private life didn't become public knowledge. The undertakers used vinegar, camphor, and every trick in the royal playbook, but the real work happened after the doors were locked and the final visitors had left. What happened next was less like a royal send-off and more like a medical crime scene. The autopsy, conducted in total secrecy by the same doctors who had spent years trying to fix Ferdinand, revealed the truth that had been hidden under layers of rumor and ritual. Dr. Flores's notes, kept hidden for decades, described what they found in detail. Ferdinand's member measured a shocking 14 inches in length, with dramatic variations in girth and a severe curvature that made normal sexual function impossible. The internal scarring and deformity explained years of failed marriages, medical interventions, and desperate attempts to produce an heir. It wasn't just an oddity, it was a physical reality that had shaped the fate of a nation. The doctors didn't just record what they found. They preserved the king's member for medical study, treating it almost like a relic. You can imagine the mix of morbid curiosity and dread in that room. The physicians had spent years working on remedies, treatments, and marital aids. Now, faced with the undeniable evidence, they finally understood why nothing had worked. Dr. Flores's secret notes spelled out the medical reality. The unusual configuration, including its extraordinary dimensions and peculiar curvature, render normal relations impossible without significant intervention. That single line explained decades of frustration, heartbreak, and palace intrigue. The royal craftsmen, it turned out, had been busy for years. They'd been tasked with creating custom marital aids, special cushions, supports, and even harnesses, each designed to solve the unsolvable problem of Ferdinand's anatomy. These devices were supposed to help preserve the dynasty, but they mostly turned the royal bedchamber into a place of humiliation and dread. The queens endured endless nights of medical procedures and failed rituals, all in the hope of producing a child. For the palace staff, these aids became a source of gossip and dark humor, but for the women involved, they were a nightmare with no end. The autopsy should have brought closure, but it only deepened the sense of unease. The doctors and undertakers who witnessed the king's secret left the chamber shaken. They had to account for the strange expenses, custom boxes, endless supplies of herbs, and barrels of wine used to mask the smell, or maybe to steady their nerves. The palace tried to keep everything quiet, but rumors always found a way out. In the kitchens and corridors, servants traded stories about what the doctors had seen, and the legend of Ferdinand's curse grew with every retelling. Secrecy was the official policy, but it didn't stop the story from spreading. Even as the king's medical records were locked away in Florence's archives, the details leaked out in coded letters, whispered warnings, and nervous glances. The king's physical reality became a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong with the Spanish monarchy, an outward sign of the inward rot. The final secret didn't just stay locked in a box. It lived on in the habits, fears, and superstitions of everyone who had served the king. It's easy to see why the palace spent fortunes trying to fix the problem. Ferdinand's obsession with potions, elixirs, and miracle cures made him an easy target for charlatans and con artists. He spent staggering sums on quack remedies, each promising to restore his anatomy or boost his fertility. Every failed treatment was another blow to the royal budget, and another reason for the court to double down on secrecy. The receipts still exist, payments for magical roots, imported tonics, and the services of healers who promised the impossible. The king's desperation became a running joke in some circles, but for the people closest to him, it was just another source of misery. The saddest part is that none of the effort made any real difference. The secret stayed hidden, but the damage was everywhere. The queen suffered through failed marriages and public scrutiny. The doctors tried everything, from surgery to superstition, but nothing worked. The royal craftsmen built their strange devices, but they only added to the sense of failure. The palace was full of people trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed, and the cost, emotional, financial, and political, was enormous. Meanwhile, the rest of Spain paid the price. The king's private pain shaped public policy. His fear of exposure led to laws that punished anyone who dared to speak out, and his obsession with secrecy fueled a culture of suspicion and repression. Every harsh law, every act of censorship, every crackdown on dissent can be traced back to that final secret. Ferdinand's death didn't end the atmosphere of fear and control. It set it in stone. Historians who finally uncovered Dr. Flores's notes saw more than just a medical case. They saw the blueprint for a reign marked by cruelty, paranoia, and wasted potential. The lesson is simple. Hiding shame doesn't make it go away. It just turns it into something bigger, something that poisons everything it touches. Ferdinand's curse wasn't just anatomical. It was the legacy of secrets left to fester. Even today, the story echoes through Spanish history. The royal tombs are heavy with the weight of worry and regret. The palaces, now mostly museums, still feel haunted by the unresolved drama of Ferdinand's reign. The anatomical curse became a cautionary tale, not just for Spain, but for anyone who thinks that hiding a problem is the same as solving it. The scars of that secret shaped the nation's destiny, and the lessons linger long after the last velvet curtain fell. If you look at the aftermath, it's clear that the real power of Ferdinand's secret wasn't in the details, but in how it shaped the choices of everyone around him. The story of the king's final secret isn't just about medical oddities or royal gossip. It's about how personal struggles, left unspoken and untreated, can ripple out to change the course of a nation. And that's a lesson history doesn't let us forget. Ferdinand VII's story is a reminder that when a ruler's private struggles spill into public life, the consequences reach far beyond palace walls. This wasn't just a king with a personal issue. It was an entire nation forced to bear the weight of his secrets, his fears, and his unchecked power. The system that tied Spain's fate to the emotional state of one man proved dangerously fragile, leaving millions vulnerable to his whims. If this tale made you rethink what really shapes history, let us know what hidden story or scandal you want to hear about next. After all, history isn't just crowns and battles. It's about the real, messy lives behind the throne.